Hey everyone, I'm going to be talking about some of the psychological impacts of trauma. One of the big psychological impacts is just some symptoms of anxiety, fear, depression. And for me, it kind of helps to understand how things work. So I'm going to introduce you to the brain model. I've seen several different variations of this. Mine just uses one hand. But basically, if you form your hands around your thumb, the thumb is your, here you can kind of see mine this way. There we go. So your thumb is like your amygdala, your hypothalamus, your thalamus. You have your brainstem, and your knuckles up here are your prefrontal cortex. So up here in the frontal cortex is where all of your decision making happens, your kind of like more of your control, your choices, your being able to weigh options. And down here in your brainstem and in your amygdala, this is like your reptilian brain. So this is the part of the brain that we share with other mammals and reptiles. And so basically this is where like all of your drives are located that are designed to help you survive. So basic eating, sleeping, protection. So one of the psychological impacts of trauma is that it takes away, as humans, we have this ability to operate out of our frontal cortex and have control over our decisions and our actions. But it removes that connection to our frontal cortex, and instead it puts us down into our reptilian brain, which limits our decision making, limits our logic. It leads to more emotional reactions. And can lead to some learning difficulties as well because you don't have access to this upper part of your brain. So as a result, a lot of folks who suffer from complex trauma, one of the psychological impacts is that you tend to have a lot of diagnosis that comes along with it. So mental health diagnosis, physical diagnosis, and then, of course, when you have these diagnoses, it leads to being prescribed multiple medications to treat these different conditions. So this kind of puts a cocktail in the body of all of this happening at the same time. And a lot of times what tends to happen is folks act out. So that could be a lot of times you see a lot of violence or suicide, threats to self, threats to others, especially for the self-threatening. The psychological impacts tend to lead to a lot of like risk-taking behaviors, like experimenting with drugs or alcohol. Because a lot of the coping mechanisms are overwhelmed. We don't have access to this up here, which teaches us how to cope and gives us that time and space to figure out what we're going to do next and how we're going to react. So we become, the amygdala becomes triggered and we go into a survival mode, fight, flight, freeze. At that point is when, dissociation can happen. And that dissociation, can just be like, daydreaming. Like you'll see kids that are just kind of drifting off and they're not really paying attention to what's going on around them. And it can go from that to some people describe out-of-body experiences during traumatic events or flashbacks, to actually developing separate identities and people. And all of this is just a coping mechanism of our brain trying to survive. So as you can imagine, when all of this is going on in the brain and the brain is focused on surviving, it's really difficult to settle down to like a calm baseline. So in the reaction trigger of like up here, we're reacting, we're fighting, we're flighting. Like down here, we're sleeping, we're resting, we're relaxing. Even after the danger is past and we're coming back down, we never quite reach that baseline calm because we're always ready to react, on guard, waiting for the next thing to happen. So that leads to a lot of difficulty focusing, a lot of trouble in school. And so all of this trauma is adding up, and a lot of the behaviors that result lead to involvement with different systems, the legal system, the school system, residential systems. And so kind of the more involved you get and the more you go down that path, the less control, so the lack of control triggers that fight, flight, freeze, survival, and it's kind of like a reinforcing cycle. So unfortunately, a lot of times, instead of treating the underlying psychological impacts of the trauma, the behaviors become the focus, not the underlying psychological deficits. You can probably see I'm starting to flush because I'm really nervous. That's part of my psychological reaction right now. And so, as you can imagine, this has a lot of social impacts for the person as they're going through this. Complex trauma is often interpersonal in nature. And what that means is that a lot of times it's the direct result of harm by a caretaker or someone that's close. So maintaining stability in a placement is often very difficult because it's hard to establish relationships. It's hard to let people in because experience has taught us that people that are close to us can hurt us. And so in an effort to survive, it's important to, keep people at a distance, but that obviously has negative social impacts. A lot of times folks who have suffered from complex trauma will have multiple different placements, and it's that cycle of the behaviors and the trauma and the behaviors of the trauma, and moving in and of itself impacts the ability to establish relationships and have healthy peer support. If you have a lack of positive relationships to draw on, it just kind of takes away your motivation to form a relationship. And at the end of the day, at some point when you have no one, but yet you crave that relationship and that attention, it gets to the point where sometimes negative attention is better than no attention at all. So the behaviors are kind of reinforcing in that way too. And, at the end of the day, this interpersonal trauma, it means that a lot by caretakers, if the trauma began at birth or shortly thereafter, it impacts the child's ability to ever form an attachment with a caretaker and be able to even just recognize the emotions of others. The part of that frontal cortex is being able to mirror emotions and to recognize that in one another. And so that requires attachment. And without that attachment, it's really difficult to learn how to feel safe or build trust in relationships. So that sums up psychological impacts.
Hi, I am going to talk to you all about how the emotional domain is impacted by complex trauma. Again, complex trauma is a recurring event that is either, some type of abuse in the sense of sexual, mental, physical, psychological, by a primary caretaker, by someone close to you. And in the infancy stage, they lack the ability to give you the nourishment, affection, and attention that you need, which leads to emotional dysregulation and impacts your ability to have insight or maybe a lack of empathy for things that are going on. You really struggle with expressing fear, happiness, paranoia, different things that affect your emotional ability to be expressive and get the positive and healthy support that you need. So a lot of the emotional experiences are suppressed. And once they suppress and it goes untreated, eventually it leads to an overload again with the receptors in the frontal cortex part of the brain. It goes into an emotional overload, and then there are some behaviors that are distributed that are self-destructive, violent, hostile, and at a very young age before you're ever, taught, learned, or have the ability to conceptualize what the appropriate means are to express your emotions. you wind up in some places that are not so conducive for well-being and upgrowth and sustaining a good, strong value system and consistency that feeds you healthy emotions and helps you build the proper insight to be able to cognitively um, interact with your social peers. So in the emotional domain, the CBP are primarily damaged, and that is the cognitive ability to concentrate. Um, you typically have the propensity to have intrusive thoughts, mood swings. The behavioral aspect that is impacted is avoidance of activities or places that may trigger memories. So, emotionally sensitive to different environmental factors that can possibly be stressors and cause immediate intense flashbacks. But even when those things occur, you still, don't have the ability to verbalize that or communicate that with someone. Physically, um, suffer from insomnia, extreme alertness, always on the lookout for warnings of potential danger, chronic muscle patterns, chronic muscle pain, which again affects and impacts your emotional state and your emotional well-being. And since the capacity to emotionally regulate properly, this directly affects the social aspect of the social support systems that are available in the community and my peer group, because of the history of complex trauma, specifically with the sexual assault and sexual abuse that was perpetuated by a caretaker. Social boundaries, are really, really confusing, and you get a sense of hyper arousal because you sort of want to seek attention, but it may not be socially appropriate, to go up and touch somebody and things like that. It's just so overwhelmingly paralyzing when you want to build and develop on social relationship, but it's just a sense of fear that kind of like destructs the initial stage of building a healthy social relationship. So that is my spiel of how the emotional domain is impacted by complex trauma. Thank you.
Okay, so now I'm going to touch on how complex trauma can have an impact on our physical bodies. So as you can imagine, when our body is in the constant fight or flight, then we aren't able to regulate ourselves. So for people that have experienced complex trauma, they are constantly triggered by little things in their daily lives. And so their body is constantly being told to either fight or flight or somehow react to these triggers that are trauma, reminding them of their trauma. So, and that looks like in a physical sense, physical symptoms that are shown can lead to anxiety, feeling of panic and weakness, feeling exhausted all the time, muscle stiffness, concentration problems, sleep problems, even like migraines and things like that as well. And so, and then, so like the symptoms that are usually there to help our bodies react to a threatening situation, like our increased pulse and our pupils become dilated, we have a cold sweat or things like that, those are usually there to help us through a trauma. But people that have experienced complex trauma are constantly experiencing those things. So their brains are wired differently than after a result of these complex traumas. And then they're in a constant state of this panic. And so that has such an impact on their physical bodies. So one way to think about this is if you think of Pavlov's dog, which we've all heard about, and the conditioned response to the dog hearing the bell and then salivating because he or the dog associates it with associates the sound of the bell with getting a treat. And so if you think of the bell as a trigger in somebody that's experienced complex trauma, then they are just kind of in this hyper-aroused state. Also, an extreme response to a threat is like a freezing reaction. So we always hear about fight or flight, but then there's also freeze. So this happens, a lot of times we see it in animals when, let's say, a mouse is caught by a cat and the mouse realizes in its brain that it's not going to be able to run away and it's not big enough to fight this cat off. And so it goes limp, it stops feeling. And people that have experienced situations like this, they report not being able to even feel their fear or pain. And so it's a way for our bodies to kind of shut down and expect the worst, but also it's a way of kind of like fighting it off because in the very basic biological sense, if it were an animal, then it would just be giving up. And so hopefully the predator would give up on the prey, basically. So that's the physical reaction of not being able to actually physically fight back. And so when we go back to the nervous system and look at this and what it looks like is we've got our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system. And in a normal individual, these two systems are kind of constantly like going up and down and working together. So I might be scared by something, but then my parasympathetic nervous system is going to come in and kind of calm me down. And so, so they work together and kind of always kind of trying to reach that equilibrium, maybe not always there, but able to kind of go through those flows pretty seamlessly. Somebody who's experienced complex trauma, they're going to be hyper aroused, and then they're never going to be able to quite reach back down to that kind of calm sense. And so this can cause changes to our brains over time, and chemical changes and neural pathway changes. And even those kind of changes, there have been studies of epigenetics, and our brain changes over time, and that can even be passed down to later generations. So our brains are physically changed by some of this complex trauma as well. And so when we're in this constant level of like high stress, our hormones are peaking, and it can lead to chronic stress. Chronic stress then can lead to heart disease, like I mentioned earlier, kind of chronic fatigue, things like fibromyalgia, migraines, digestive problems, and even asthma sometimes tied in with complex trauma. And even physical symptoms can kind of be misunderstood as other things. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is commonly misdiagnosed in people that have complex trauma because some of the symptoms are really the same. Hyperactive, inattentive, disorganized, which looks just like somebody who's experienced complex trauma. Hyperarousal, they have intrusive thoughts, and they're avoiding people. So physically, sometimes this complex trauma can kind of be hard to identify because it can look like other things. So let's see. As you can imagine, all these physical symptoms of the complex trauma can have then a result on someone's social life. So let's imagine a kid that has had complex trauma and they're trying to go through school and learn. Well, they're going to have a really hard time learning because they're always trying to fight off some kind of threat that they are, or something that they're perceiving as a threat. So they're not able to focus on learning how to read because they're trying to fight off something else. So, so unfortunately, then that leads to like decreased academic achievement, decreased school attendance, lower reading levels, and things like that. Then that's going to have even more of a social impact on that person around their peers. And then they're going to become starting to get involved with more social systems and things like that, which are there to help, but at the same time has an impact on their social life. And then another way how this can impact us socially is we are all, humans are social beings, so we're always connected to other human beings. and we're very in tune with other people, and our neurons can even pick up on other people's neurons. So if somebody might have the slightest little reaction or eyebrow kind of squint or things like that, and we can pick up on that. Somebody who hasn't experienced complex trauma can kind of pick up on that and be able to understand maybe, oh, that person doesn't understand what I'm saying, or they didn't like what I said, or something like that. Somebody with complex trauma might not be able to pick up on that as accurately as somebody who doesn't have complex trauma. So somebody who has had complex trauma has a hard time kind of understanding others in social situations, and also they themselves may be misunderstood in social situations because they aren't necessarily able to react to others appropriately, or will just have adverse reactions to other folks' social interactions. So complex trauma can really have quite a impact on us, even physically, even though it's something that we wouldn't necessarily think would have a physical impact on us. So complex trauma can affect us in so many different ways. All right, thank you.